It's indisputable that working with RAW files is always better than working with other formats simply because we have more information. And as a result, you'll even hear people say jokes like, you should always shoot in the RAW, but don't shoot in the buff because you might get arrested. And while we want to shoot and capture in the RAW, one of the things that we need to consider when adopting a RAW workflow and when working with Adobe Camera Raw is what type of RAW format do we actually want to use. Let me explain. Well, you have two options really. You can either use the native RAW file that comes straight off the camera, or you can choose another option, which involves converting that native file into a digital negative or a DNG format. Well, let's take a look at the pros and cons between using the native format or between using this digital negative. First, let's start off with our native format. Well, typically what happens is when you capture an image, you can see that you have it here and it comes off the camera, in this case a Canon 5D Mark II, as a .cr2 file. Well, if I open that image up in Adobe Camera Raw, what will then happen is I'll make some adjustments, and those adjustments will be saved in a sidecar XMP file. Here you can see there's a lot of different text inside of this file. And this is simply a small set of instructions which say add contrast to this or display this image with contrast and sharpening and then this type of color adjustment. So one of the advantages obviously of raw processing is that we're not actually modifying pixels, rather we're simply changing a set of instructions. Yet one of the downsides of using this native file format is that the connection between the raw file and between the XMP file isn't very close, or it's not tied very tightly together. Let me explain that. For example, let's say that we decide we want to move this file. Well, if we go ahead and move this file, you'll notice that what's happening here is the XMP file isn't moving with it. And what could happen is this XMP file could kind of get left behind. Now, if we lose this file altogether, what will happen then is we'll completely lose all the processing that we've done on this photograph. So again, one of the downsides is that there isn't a tight connection between these two files. Now that being said, one of the advantages of using this particular approach is that if we're careful, we can of course bring these so that they're always next to each other. And we can also open up and process this file with our manufacturer's software. And some people argue that being able to do that is really advantageous because the manufacturer knows something about this raw file that perhaps Adobe doesn't. Therefore, perhaps we can get more out of the file by leaving it in its native raw format. Now, on the other hand, we have this DNG format. Now, if we shoot an image and capture a CR2, we can then convert it to a DNG file, as I've done so here. Now, the advantage of this is that if we ever decide to move this image, everything travels with it. In other words, we never even really know about this XMP file. You don't need to know that exists. Rather, it takes the raw file and also the data about the processing of the file, and it puts it inside of a container. I almost like to think of this as a little Tupperware container. And the advantage of this is obviously that now it's all contained in one format, which then contains the original raw information, plus all of this XMP info, and some other information as well in regards to our preview and whatnot. So the advantage here obviously is that it's much more concise and it's condensed. Well, in more practical terms, let's take a look at what a DNG file is. Well, really what it is, it's Adobe's way of saying, hey, let's have an open, non-proprietary raw format. In other words, let's kind of lift the lid on things. Rather than keep secrets, let's say that this is a format that anyone can access and understand. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, some of the pros for this are we don't need XMP files. It also contains some previews, there's some compression. In other words, the file will be significantly smaller. And also, it's going to increase our archival confidence. In other words, let's say 40 years from now, the software manufacturer, which i.e. is the camera manufacturer, may actually not support certain file types. Well, in this case, we have this assurance that moving forward, this DNG file format will be more supported, especially since Adobe's behind it, which is a software company. The other advantage is that it gives us a single raw processing solution. Rather than having to jump between different applications, we can all process our images in one context. Now, the cons I've alluded to a little bit. One of them is that we're converting our proprietary raw files to another format, and also once we do that, we can't go backwards and then use our camera manufacturer's software. So then what's the conclusion? Well, you're going to need to make the decision for yourself, but in my own workflow, I've adopted a complete 100% DNG workflow, and I've done so because of these different advantages listed here. Whenever I can get a smaller file size, I'm all about that. Also, dropping the need for XMP files, having this single raw processing solution, and also the confidence that this brings in regards to having these images being able to be accessed and opened in the future. Now, of course, you're going to need to make your own decision. So if you want to learn more about this DNG format, what you can do is go ahead and navigate over to Adobe's site. And if you navigate to adobe.com/products/DNG, there you can read and learn more about this DNG format. I also want to highlight here that if you do decide to adopt this DNG format, here at the same location, you can actually download what's called the DNG converter, either for Windows or for Mac, which allows you to convert your native raw files into this format.